All right, we're back on the set of BookView Now. We're pbs.org. This is BookCon 2015. I'm with Jesse George, who you met in our last segment, and we now have Brian Selznick on the set with us. Brian, how awesome to have you here.
Thank you so much. So happy to be here.
Yeah,
Thank
great. You. Jesse and I are both really big fans of your work, but The Marvels is another incredible book, and I think anybody who needs to know anything about The Marvels can just look at the side of the book, because you see the images here, and then we move into the actual novel of the book. What an incredible, this must take you forever, but we'll talk lots about it. I know that this kind of book is a combination of all of your artwork plus a novel that's sort of tucked in the center. That's a little bit different than the way you've worked your other books previously.
Yeah, Hugo, The Invention of Hugo Cabret told one story with words and pictures going back and forth. Wonderstruck had two different stories, but they wove from picture to word, picture to word, picture to word. And this, I thought, what would happen if we told an entire narrative that took 150 years just in pictures, and we had all of that first, and then followed it up with part two, which was all text. But ultimately, it's all part of the story of the novel.
Yeah, that's incredible. Jesse, you read The Marvels, right?
I'm almost done with it. I'm working on
I hope
it.
I hope you like the rest of it.
I'm loving it so far.
What do you think? Yes. What do you think of The Marvels?
It's incredible. I know that you consider this like a trilogy. Can you explain that a little bit?
I mean, usually trilogies have, the same characters and the same settings often that follow through the three books. But there's other kinds of trilogies that are connected by themes and by ideas and structure. And I know that Maurice Sendak thought about Where the Wild Things Are, Outside Over There, and In the Night Kitchen as a trilogy, all related to, his ideas around childhood and things that had happened to him personally. And so for Hugo, Wonderstruck, and The Marvels, it's very much a trilogy connected by this strange kinds of ways of telling a story with words and pictures, but also ultimately all three of them are about how we make our own family and what that means, because that's something that everyone ultimately sort of grows up in some fashion does. And even as kids, we build our people, we bring our people around us. So that's what these books are ultimately about.
It's awesome.
Yeah, and obviously there's a huge inspiration about the theater. This whole book is driven by sort of classic across the century theater and a family that sort of spans generations and the differences there. What's your interest in theater, and how does that play into how you created this book?
Yeah, I wanted to be a set designer when I was younger, and I acted a lot when I was starting in high school. I always got cast as the old man. I always played the old man in like every play. A lot of powder in my hair. But I've always loved the theater, and I love set design and what happens when the curtains open and you see the setting on stage. And I just am very intrigued by how you tell a story on stage. And I'm also a puppeteer. I've made my own 19th century sort of toy theaters, and there's a lot of overlap between theater and bookmaking. But of course, in a theater, you've got the director, the actors, the writer, the lighting designer, the costume designer. But in a book, as the person making the book, you can kind of be all of those things. But I had wanted to make a story about 19th century actors and Shakespearean actors, and I was very intrigued by families of actors who passed down their art form from generation to generation. And so I very much wanted to take those ideas of the theater and put them into this. But all of my books in some way are related to the theater. My books, if you go back through all of my books, there's constantly curtains that open up and bring us into some kind of stage, although usually the stage is not literally a stage, it's some other world. But here the stage is actually a stage.
Yeah.
The drawings. Talk to Jesse and I about the drawings.
How long did it take you to do it?
A long time.
A long time.
Yeah, so the whole book took about 3 years to make.
Right.
And I have some very vague ideas about what I want the story to be. I have the idea about theater. This book was also very inspired by a real house in London that is still kept as if it's the 18th and 19th centuries. And so that was a very big inspiration. Wow. And so I to London, I did my research, I photographed models, I do little tiny thumbnail sketches that are literally like this big, just from my head.
Wow.
And I can do those from my head, like I can have a good sense of action and character, but I'm not very good at drawing very realistically out of my head, so I need photographs of models and real things, and I can look at the way fabric folds in a shirt, and then I can translate that. And then I spent an entire year just doing the drawings that appear in the book.
Wow.
And they're all done 1/4 size, so they're about this big in real life.
Wow.
And I work under a magnifying glass that's sort of on an arm, sort of like this lamp, except it has a magnifying glass, and I look through the magnifying glass and I have a very sharp pencil that I do all of the drawings with. So it's fun to see them blown up to this big in the book, and then
the magnifying glass is very cool.
yeah.
You know, the other thing is that you draw as if we're looking through a lens. I mean, you'll come in closer and closer on an image, and you'll spend 3 or 4 or 5 pages sometimes, like bringing us in on a scene. And we'll start out wide, and then we'll get tighter and tighter. You always think very cinematically in your books, and it's a different kind of artistry, obviously.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, I think especially starting with the invention of Hugo Cabret, which has a lot to do with the history of cinema, I wanted to see if I could tell part of the story like a movie, like to think about how a camera in a movie tells the story.
Right.
What happens when you're tracking through a shot, or when you edit, or when you do a close-up, and you think of, you know, like Alfred Hitchcock, the way he would zoom in on the thing that's the most important, the clue that you have to be aware of. And so those ideas were very influential on me, and then sort of carried through with Wonderstruck and with the Marvels as well, is how does the camera, or the point of view that I'm as the illustrator sort of controlling for the reader's experience. Because very much what this is me as much as possible trying to control what your experience of the story is, and how you take the story in. Although once you have it in your hand, you know, I'm out. You know, it's then yours.
So when you're, and Jesse, I love your thought on this too. Like when you're going through this book, I didn't need words at all. I mean, for those first couple hundred pages, there was not a word. I think there's a couple scenes where you're giving us newspaper clippings to kind of give us a little bit of context, but without a word for 50 or 60 pages, I was completely enraptured and understood the story perfectly.
How difficult is that to like write a story just through pictures?
It was very challenging, especially because I don't ever draw first. I write everything first.
Right.
So I will write what I want to draw, even if I know that it's going to ultimately be just pictures, because the idea came very early to tell the first part just with pictures. But I'll start by writing, we see a ship at night on the sea. There's a girl tied to the mast. A dragon, you know, is threatening her, and she looks up and sees an angel. And so you can write a lot of stuff like that, but sometimes you also write, you know, other sort of more conceptual ideas. But then it's like, how do I get across that? Like, you know, the boy's unhappy and he's going to run away. You know, like, how do you get across what it is that's making him unhappy? And so as much as possible, it was, you know, trying to find visual solutions for all of those questions. But then whenever I came up against a wall and there was just no way that a visual image could tell something, that's when you get the newspaper article or a letter or a postcard, just a little hint that there is, you know, something where we need to understand what a character's thought is, where there's no other way except for them to write it. But I think there's one letter, one postcard, and a couple of newspaper. But otherwise, it's hundreds of pages of just the pictures.
It's actually incredible. You talked about the house. It's this weird, quirky house in London that you found that served as the inspiration. Have you got to that part yet, Justin? Yeah.
Spoilers? No, it's okay.
Well, it's not in the book necessarily, but it is like an inspiration for it. And maybe you could explain how you found it, first of all, and what it is.
Yeah, my husband and I were traveling in London, and a friend told us about this strange house that's kept as if it's still the 18th and 19th centuries. And so we found it and we knocked on the door, and it turned out it has very unusual hours and they were just closing. But we were both somewhat desperate to get inside by that point because it overlapped with a lot of our interests. And the man at the door sort of looked at us and our sad faces and took pity on us. And he let us in, and he said, you know, welcome to the past, the journey is yours. And he sort of set it up and then told us what route to walk. But then other than that, we were just on our own. And you walk inside, and the candles are burning. There's half-eaten food that's just been cooked on the tables. There's hot tea in the teacups. There's laundry by the floor. The chamber pots by the beds are often full. And so there's there's smells and there's sounds, and you hear footsteps in other rooms, and the sense is that as you walk into each room, the people from that time have just stepped out. So it's not like you're, I don't know, it's not like you're in the future looking at this thing in the past. It's like you are in that time period, and that time period is the present.
And that was always a vision for this place. That's what I wanted you to feel.
Yeah. And so by the time we finished our walk through the house, we were both in tears. And the man at the door turned out to be the curator, David Milne, who was friends with the man who founded the house, Dennis Severs, and who himself was actually a Californian who moved to London and built this house from scratch. And so it was very much made to give you this sense that you are in the past, and that the past is present. And it was probably the most uncanny experience I've ever had, where I really felt like this is what time travel would be like. And we became really good friends with David Milne, and we've gone back to the house dozens of times, all different times of the year. He changes the decorations depending on what the holidays are. He cooks different food depending on what the time of the year is. And I had that idea and that house very much in the back of my head for an inspiration for a book. And I had this other idea for this theater book. And eventually it was my husband who said, why don't you make them the same book?
Right.
And there were really interesting ways that they overlapped. And so that's how the Marvels sort of came to be.
Man, the power of collaboration. Sometimes those ideas don't come together on their own. You need a little helpful shove. Sometimes.
Exactly.
Well, the book is absolutely stunning.
Oh, thank you.
It's a beautiful book. It really fits so nicely with Hugo Cabaret, which is made into a wonderful movie by, of all people, Martin Scorsese. I mean, jackpot. Wonderstruck, and now the Marvels. And I see each one of these as a movie, and not because they're necessarily going to be made into movies, but because they read so much like movies.
Thank you.
And they're so beautiful. And Jesse and I are huge fans.
Yes, for sure.
And we'll slather on some more praise off stage. But in the meantime, it's so nice to have you.
Thank you
Thanks
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.